unfinished. However, it would not be his war with Christianity that would bring him down, but rather his far more mundane and worldly war with Persia. Next week, the Emperor will take to the field ready to score a victory against the Sassanids. But unfortunately, beyond score a victory, he didn't seem to have much strategic direction. What would a victory even look like? Did he want to sack the capital, beat Shapur in a big battle, remove Shapur from power completely, conquer the whole of Persia? What? No one really knew what the ultimate objective was, and it may have been the case that Julian himself did not even know what the ultimate objective was. The Emperor liked to jump into things with both feet. Once again, it appears that he really should have looked before he leaped. This week's episode is brought to you by Audible. As you know, Audible is the internet's leading provider of audio entertainment with over 80,000 titles to choose from. When you're done with this episode, go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome. That again, audiblepodcast.com/Rome. By going to that address, you qualify for a free book download when you sign up for a 14-day trial membership. There is no obligation to continue the service, and you can cancel anytime and keep the free book. You can also keep going with one of the monthly subscription options and get great deals on all future audiobook purchases. If you are just now getting to this episode, this week I initially passed along a listener recommendation for 1421, the year China discovered the world. However, I must confess that I did not do my usual due diligence on researching the merits of the book, and so just now discovered that 1421 is basically pseudo-historical nonsense that relies on no good evidence whatsoever, speculates wildly beyond the facts, and that the author, Gavin Menzies, is basically a novelist pretending to be a historian. I am embarrassed to have given 1421 the History of Rome seal of approval. It is not good history, and I sincerely apologize for what can only be described as a sloppy recommendation. How about next time I just recommend the History of the World in 100 Objects, or maybe one of those Star Wars books that people keep wanting me to plug. Just remember to go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome so that they know who sent you. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 146, The Spear of Destiny. Last week, we covered the wide range of reforms Julian initiated after becoming emperor. Though he is usually remembered as the man who tried to stem the tide of Christianity, we should not forget that he was interested in more than just religion. And given enough time, it is possible that we could have been sitting here talking about Julian as a major transformative figure. But instead, we talk about him merely as a brief detour, an accidental left turn, noticed and corrected within a block of the mistake. This week, we will get into why Julian's imperial course correction never got the empire further down his pagan principate side road. In the end, it wasn't because of institutional barriers, entrenched interests, or even the irresistible destiny of Christianity. It was because of a forgotten breastplate and an anonymously thrown spear. After a frustrating winter spent butting heads with the citizens of Antioch, Julian was eager to leave behind the aggravating belligerency of his fellow citizens and focus his attention on a much easier enemy to grapple with, the Sassanids. He didn't have to worry about placating the Sassanids or making friends with the Sassanids or even caring what the Sassanids thought about his reform agenda. He just needed to beat the crap out of the Sassanids. I imagine that as much as Julian was looking forward to the political bounce he would get from a successful campaign in the East, that he was also looking forward to the cathartic relief he would get from a good, hard fight. Much to Julian's consternation, however, the Sassanids were presently trying to duck that fight. The Persian king Shapur II spent most of his epic reign, which was an amazing 70 years long, vacillating between aggression and pacifism towards Rome, and it appears that with the death of his old enemy Constantius II, that the king was ready to once again enter one of his passive phases. His recent victories, which had included the sack of Amida, had turned out to have been of the Pyrrhic variety. That is, the costs of the campaign far outweighed the benefits. Further fighting at this point would probably only shift the border between Rome and Persia a few yards in either direction, so what was the point? Shapur reached out to Julian and tried to work out a peace agreement that would satisfy both leaders, but Julian was not having it. He had come east to make war on the Sassanids, not to make peace with the Sassanids. Though the terms were reasonable, and it is hard to see how rejecting them benefited Rome in the final, to take him through the early years of his reign, and that game plan said very clearly, win a great victory against Persia. So Julian refused to listen to terms. If I make peace, I won't be able to win a great victory against Persia, and it says very clearly right here that I need to win a great victory against Persia. You get the feeling like Shapur could have offered control of the whole Sassanid Empire and promised to become the emperor's private footstool, and Julian still would have demanded a war. So in March of 363, Julian left Antioch at the head of an army, telling those lousy ingrate Antiochians on his way out the door that he was never, ever coming back. Though the estimates for the size of Julian's army vary from a low of 65,000 to a high of 90,000, there is one thing we can be sure of. Julian was mustering every available soldier he could get his hands on. He even demanded that the king of Armenia send an auxiliary army to help shore up the Roman ranks. Julian wanted nothing less than a total, complete, and overwhelming victory, and he did not want to leave anything to chance. However, though an army the size of Julian's eastern invasion force, whatever size it actually was, would have made the emperor an unstoppable juggernaut back in Gaul, out here in Syria, it made him merely equal to the task. By most estimates, the army Shapur had in the field was able to match the Romans man for man. When you throw in the fact that most of the soldiers in the Roman army were either recently recruited or had been transferred over from the west and were unused to desert fighting, well, even 100,000 men might not have been equal to the task. In other words, Julian might have thought he wasn't leaving anything to chance, but he was still going to need a healthy dose of luck to pull this thing off. Beyond questions about whether his army could do what Julian wanted them to do, the emperor is often criticized for marching east without a clear strategic aim beyond victory for victory's sake. Sadly, for the men of the Roman army, though, no one realized quite how rudderless this war actually was in the beginning, because Julian appeared to have a very clear idea of what he was doing. He was going to attack the Sassanid capital of Ctesiphon. To pull this off, the emperor knew that he would need to keep Shapur off his back for a little while. The Persian king was up in the north near the Armenian border with the bulk of his veteran army, and that is exactly where Julian wanted him to stay. To keep Shapur in place, Julian peeled off 20 to 30,000 of his men, the variation depending on how large you think his overall army was, and sent them to feign an attack on Medea. The emperor hoped that in the fog of war, this decoy invasion force would be taken for the main invasion force, and confound Shapur's reaction time accordingly. Even if the king saw through the Medea feint, Julian reckoned that Shapur would, at the very least, assume the Romans would be taking the easy route down the Tigris to attack Ctesiphon, and so, while the decoy army marched northeast, Julian himself chose the tougher, but less expected route down the Euphrates. Despite his lack of a coherent strategy, Julian did not neglect his logistical responsibilities, and after reaching the Euphrates, he rendezvoused with a fleet of some 1,000 ships that he had ordered constructed to keep the food and munitions flowing. With his years in Gaul marked by constant supply problems, Julian was making damn sure that he would not have to worry about some latter-day Barbatio seizing his grain and burning his supply transports. The preparations were complete by early April, and Julian spent the next month methodically making his way south towards the Sassanid capital. As the Romans marched, they seized control of any cities or military outposts they happened by. Since the majority of these were only lightly garrisoned, the resistance they met during these first few weeks was sporadic and short-lived. It wasn't until they were closing in on Ctesiphon that Julian and his army finally ran into some real pushback. 2 cities in a row shut up their gates and attempted to resist, and though in both cases the Romans won after a quick, hard battle, the fights did lay bare the realities of siege warfare in the Desert Keep. As the Roman army neared Ctesiphon, the big question became how to get his men and his 1,000 ships over to the capital. You see, part of the reason the approach along the Tigris was easier was because Ctesiphon is actually located on the Tigris. Having tens of thousands of soldiers and 1,000 supply ships doesn't do you much good if you're, on the complete wrong river. The obvious answer was to take the long way around. That is, head down to the confluence of the rivers and then turn around and row upstream. But that route was arduous and fraught with danger, and Julian had no intention of exposing his army if he didn't have to. And he was pretty sure that he didn't have to. You see, Julian knew a little secret that had been lost to the ages. Once upon a time, the kings of Persia had built a canal connecting the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. But due to excessive flooding, the canal had long ago been blocked up, and now sat around as an innocuous dry ditch. Julian located this royal canal, and had his men knock out the dam that kept the long-forgotten channel dry. Just like that, the Romans had a straight path from here to there. Thus, in mid-May of 363, the Sassanid garrison defending Ctesiphon was dismayed to discover a massive Roman invasion fleet descending on them not from the north or from the south, where attacks were to be expected, but from the west, which, wait, what? With Shapur stalled, but by this point no longer completely fooled, by the decoy army in the north, the soldiers defending Ctesiphon were also dismayed to learn that they were on their own. Been delighted by his prospects, and even more delighted by the result of the initial encounter between his men and the Ctesiphon garrison. The Persians lined up for battle in front of the city, but rather than attack them directly, Julian spent the day lulling them into a false sense of security by making a big show of settling in and not paying much attention to the opposing army. But as soon as night fell, Julian ordered a surprise attack. The resulting battle lasted well into the next day, and eventually the Sassanids were pushed back into the city. But critically, the Romans did not immediately follow up this success, and they retired before capturing the city in one fell swoop. Which is unfortunate, because that day's battle would prove to be the